I will go ahead and kick us off for our Water Resources Research Institute annual conference. I thank you all very, very much for taking the time both today and tomorrow to experience us virtually, where normally we would be in person together. I think we have enough experience now to make this very successful. And I would encourage you all to find the opportunities in the networking this evening, in the chat box, and together with our panels and speakers to make the time to reach out to one another and engage actively in this virtual space. We've got a great lineup, and it's a pleasure to welcome you. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Susan White. I'm the director of the North Carolina Water Resources Research Institute. I am sitting in my kids' playroom. Although it looks like a lovely, lovely lake behind us. This is North Carolina Lake. I believe it was Lake James. Katie can correct me. The work that we have today is wonderful. It's fast-paced. We have a lot to cover between our plenary speaker, which I'll introduce Scott here shortly, our panelists, our student lightning presentations, which I'm really excited about. Those will result in an award tonight. And also our networking, career networking opportunity. That's unusual for, I would say it's just for tonight, not for tomorrow night as well. So take good advantage of that. And then we'll repeat this tomorrow afternoon, including the North Carolina Soil and Water Conservation District posters, which will rotate during our brief break this afternoon. And then our North Carolina Source Water Collaborative Awards, which will be noted tomorrow afternoon as well. So there are great opportunities to learn about our water resources here in North Carolina. Anna has done a fantastic job, as you all know, with the communications. There are opportunities for continuing education credits, PHs, and a lot of great things today and tomorrow. So welcome. Thank you for your engagement. We had over 350 registrants for both 2 days. And we're excited to welcome you all. And it's really an interesting space for us. I'll bring your attention to how you can rename yourself on your screen so you can indicate where you're from if you choose to do so. We have over, in addition to the North Carolina universities, we have universities from Virginia, Iowa, Texas, California joining us, Georgia. So it's not, one of the things about virtual space is that we can engage a little bit more broadly and bring new people and new perspectives in, and we appreciate that engagement. Our industry partners, we had over 47 joining us, many of which you can find on our website as partners, and also this afternoon during our networking career discussions. Our state, local, and federal government partners, all of the municipalities are present and accounted for. And while we would normally see each other in person and be able to see the diversity that we have, we'll be doing it here today and tomorrow in our virtual space. And we'll also point out that we have our nonprofit partners here as well. So really that breadth of industry, government, academic, and nonprofit that looks at how we look at water resources and the importance that they hold, not only for North Carolina and the region, but for the nation. So I have the pleasure of introducing Scott Berry. Scott was going to be our plenary last year. Happily, he is back this year. And Scott is the Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the U.S. Water Alliance. He's located in Washington, D.C. And the Water Alliance is a national organization advancing policies and programs that builds a sustainable water future. Prior to the U.S. Water Alliance, Scott spent 9 years as head lobbyist on water infrastructure and water policy issues for the Utility Infrastructure Division at the Associated General Contractors of America. It's a long title there. So Scott's very much engaged with national water policy, water priorities, and how we're all collectively need to work together for that. So Scott, I welcome you and offer you the platform. Thank you so much.
Great. Hopefully folks can see my screen now. And really super appreciate that introduction, Susan. And you're right, it was a super long, weird, awkward title, but they wouldn't change it when I was there. I can't say that was the reason I left, but you know how it is. But I really want to appreciate Susan and Anna and all the Institute folks for their invitation to come talk to you today. So my name is Scott. I'm the Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the U.S. Water Alliance. I have the pleasure of running the Alliance's DC office, and I absolutely love coming to talk to folks in the Carolinas. My in-laws are from here. My wife was born in Raleigh. So some of my favorite cities are here, and some of the best, One Water work in the country is being done right here. And you should all be proud that organizations like mine hold up your work as examples for the rest of the country. And you're going to hear about some more of that great work today from my friends on the panel right after me. And usually, if we were all in person or in some big ballroom or conference center or something, I kind of usually would take this opportunity to force you to talk to your table mates. And I usually ask folks to think about or remember what brought them to water work in the first place, what their water origin story is, so to speak. But y'all will kind of have to imagine that experience of chit-chatting with each other. But I do want folks to toss in the chat maybe like one sentence about your name, where you're from, and what your one line is about why you do this work. So don't be shy. I would love folks to just start doing that, kind of pouring in, put that thought in. If it does not come in immediately, that's okay. But I would love to see just a wall of this is why I'm showing up to places like this institute here. So but what I want to accomplish today is a bit of a framing exercise. I wanted to get you thinking about water management in a broader, kind of bigger picture sense. And then my co-presenters are going to get into some great ideas and examples about how to implement and put into practice what I'm talking about. So for those that don't know the Alliance, the U.S. Water Alliance is a national membership organization of utilities and businesses and nonprofits and academic institutions, green groups. They're all sort of dedicated to this concept of One Water. And our work really educates the nation on the true value of water and the need to invest in that infrastructure. And it accelerates the adoption of One Water management strategies through things like dialogues and papers, policy development. But it also celebrates what works and drives innovation in the sector by highlighting One Water champions, a lot of whom you're going to hear from today. But we really try to unite diverse interests around advancing common ground solutions to our nation's most pressing water challenges. And we try to use our diverse network to try and tackle those big challenges in the water sector that no individual organization or place can solve on their own. And there's a lot that we offer. So this is my one-time quick plug. I encourage folks to check out some of our reports, our campaigns, materials, et cetera, uswateralliance.org. We are really building this One Water movement, and consider this your official invitation to come join the movement itself. But I'm going to start a little bit broader today and then sort of zoom in about how this impacts water and you. But I first want to talk a little bit about kind of innovation and idea adoption. I'm borrowing this concept from behavioral science folks that study technology adoption, but I think it's really helpful to also think about it in the context of water practices. So the idea is that you can break down people into sort of 5 rough groups based on their behavior around adopting technology. So think about, say, like a new phone. And the first group is this group of innovators. It's the ones that definitely want to be the first ones to own and experiment with the new thing. Then you've got your early adopters. They're the ones that are not necessarily first in line to get that new phone, that new shiny object, but they're the ones who, once they see what the innovators are doing, they're the first ones to sort of envision the broader applications. And these two groups together are known as the early market, and they're about 16% of people. Then you've got your early majority. Those are the folks that worry about the risks of being the first or the second to try something out. But once they see what those innovators, those early adopters are doing, and they see proof of improvement, they're really quick to incorporate that in their own lives. And once these folks are adopters, you've now crested more than half of people. And the last two groups are your late majority, your laggards. So the people who are resistant to change, who are skeptical or even critical of change. Think about maybe grandpa who couldn't think about why a phone would need apps or why it didn't come with buttons on the front in the first place. The real point of this exercise is to look at what they call the chasm, right? The gap between the early market and the mainstream market. And this chasm is important for 2 reasons. The first is that understanding its existence and figuring out what people need to cross that chasm and convert is really how innovations get adopted. The second is that the failure to cross that chasm and convert people into adopters is one of, if not the reason why technologies fail. So if we think about this in the context of ideas and practices rather than, like hard technology, we understand the goal of U.S. Water Alliance is to cross the chasm with the idea of One Water. So now that we understand the context, I want to talk to you about why now is such a key time to be talking about these kinds of ideas and this kind of change, right? So the obvious place to start is the global pandemic that we've all been living through for the past year. It's the giant elephant in the room, right? The COVID and the resulting public health and economic crises really exposed some deep flaws in our water system around things like access or operations or funding. But even before the pandemic, the world was changing, right? Like the communities of today look vastly different than the ones our water systems were built for. Our population is different, our economy is different, our workforce is different, our environment's different, our climate is different. These are a whole bunch of new realities that are going to require some dramatic and bold changes to the way that we think about and we manage water. And a lot of my conversations over the past year with folks just like you are ones that I wouldn't have expected to ever have. And as much as COVID has exposed the flaws in our system, it has also created some really significant cracks in some of the institutional and political barriers to progress. The bottom line here is that we are at a very unique and pivotal moment right now, and business as usual is not going to work. The water landscape is changing, and it's changing fast. So it used to be that like water leaders like us could be successful. When I say us, I mean all of you all. Usually you would see me sort of gesturing at you in the room, but it used to be that we could all just sort of like sit comfortably in our silos, kind of focusing on things like regulatory compliance or research and you know, keep our heads down. But moving forward, I think I am firmly of the belief that that is a recipe for failure. We've reached a tipping point because of the pandemic, because of extreme weather, because of issues like, you know, the tragedy in Flint. People are paying attention for the first time in decades. People are talking about at the kitchen table issues of water. And we have a new workforce reality too, right? Like the millennial generation, the one that's rising in power in the workforce as the boomers are starting to retire, is the most conservation focused and innovative generation in history. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a millennial myself, but we have this huge opportunity to drastically change how we do business in the water sector. And we're also at an innovation tipping point too, right? Like we have reached a maturation of knowing what works, and now we desperately need to scale those solutions across the whole water sector. And we need to prepare for the issues that we have today, but also the issues that we're going to face in the future. You know, we've seen problems like aging infrastructure and water pollution and climate change. And under all of that is equity. Like when there's a crisis, the low income and communities of color get hit first and they get hit worst. And they're often left out of the policy conversations that impact their water futures. And even how the industry is organized is hindering progress. Like right now, we're talking about more than 50,000 different drinking water systems alone in the United States. And this fragmentation makes tackling our challenges at scale completely inefficient. There's so much talent in the water sector and so many great ideas, but we just don't have the time or the resources for thousands of different entities to find solutions on their own. We desperately, again, need to scale those solutions. So that solution that I'm looking at is One Water. So I'm aware that at this point, I'm about 8 minutes into this conversation. I have not started a sentence with the phrase One Water is yet, right? So that's this part right now. So One Water is a philosophy of integrated, inclusive, and sustainable water management. Since it's a sort of philosophy or a mindset, it's sort of tough to put everything into a single sentence. So I'm going to talk about the kinds of things that encompass One Water to really help you get there. And it's an approach to water management that busts down a lot of silos between like drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, but also between thinking about like water for fish and water for farmers or water for cities, right? It's about having a holistic approach to the nation's most pressing water challenges, because we need that new paradigm for how we lead on water to drive the kind of landscape-wide change that we need to see to get that sort of sustainable water future for all that is the Alliance's sort of vision. And we call this approach One Water. So there's several hallmarks of One Water. The first of which is the mindset that all water has value, from the water resources in our ecosystems to our drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, et cetera. The second is approaching decisions with a systems mindset that encompasses the full water cycle and our larger infrastructure systems. This allows us to evaluate water decisions using a multiple benefits approach, using economic, environmental, and social returns, right? It's also utilizing watershed scale thinking and action that respects and responds to the natural ecosystem, the geology and hydrology of an area, not just political boundaries. And I say that as the policy guy, as the political, like the political dude. One Water also, those sorts of approaches help us think about the means and the needs to help us arrive at the right kinds of solutions. And One Water approaches also use partnerships for progress, recognizing that real progress is only made when all stakeholders have a seat at the table. This is super important. And if you're taking notes or whatever, I want you to write this down and underline it. The most durable solutions are equitable solutions. Let me say that again. Most durable solutions are equitable solutions. So what does One Water mean to us, right? So when One Water first got started as a term of art in the industry, I think it was mostly used in utility terms, right? Thinking about wastewater and drinking water in a more unified way, or of a utility that did both wastewater and drinking water, maybe even stormwater, and that was called like a one water utility. But I think that one water has evolved beyond that thinking in the last several years. And I think that that older, more utility-centric conception of one water is still important. Lots of people talk about it in terms like integrated water management now, and I think that's a necessary but not sufficient way of defining one water. You need that part, but can't do the job alone. So when we think about one water, we conceive of it in some broader terms, like we think about 6 overlapping arenas for action. Like the ideal one water solutions touch on as many of these things as possible, and includes perspectives at the table that represent these interests, right? They cover a wide range of issues. They're on your screen now. They're like about utilities, about cities, about industry, about agriculture, about social economic inclusion, and healthy waterways. You don't have to write all these down now. I'm going to go through each one of them in turn, but just know there's a whole bunch of these kind of up there. And many of these, as some of you are going to be quick to point out, right, these are interdependent, right? And even this graphic doesn't sort of capture the fact that all of these things aren't necessarily just touching one or two other circles. They all overlap one another. And they reflect that battleground where we're starting to change business as usual when it comes to water. And I want to talk a tiny little bit about each area just to give you a sense of where each one fits into the broader one water landscape. Some of this is probably not going to be super revelatory to some of you, but others, this may be the first time you're hearing this. So I'm going to kind of go through this. So the first arena is the reliable and resilient water utilities. And it reflects that utilities are anchoring actors in this conversation. And they have many strategies available to them, like in DC, where I'm based. There's DC's Blue Plains treatment facility, where they're transforming wastewater into a resource using thermal hydrolysis, and they're turning biosolids into energy at the power plant. Over in Chicago, like where this is, the Stickney Water Reclamation Plant is recovering nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and turning them into fertilizer. And then the second arena is thriving cities. So we're the first generation in the history of the world where the majority of people are living in cities. And planning for water at the city level, not just across water systems, but across all city departments, can be a really, really effective one water strategy. Like the city of Los Angeles just finished their One Water LA integrated plan a couple years back. And that plan connects and coordinates the city's actions, departments, and investments across the whole water cycle for the whole city. Like that's starting to really think big and thinking about how cities see their place in the one water cycle. Third is competitive business and industry, right? So achieving one water would be impossible without direct private sector involvement. So for business leaders, one water means adopting like holistic systems approaches to their company's water footprints. And so one great example of that is down in Texas, one of Dow DuPont's largest manufacturing facilities, down there near Lake Jackson. It's a state and an area that's expected to see longer, hotter droughts, but to reduce waste and conserve resources and really be better corporate citizens with their city. Dow worked with the city of Lake Jackson to divert their treated wastewater to Dow's sort of intake canal rather than just to the river. So the Dow then takes their wastewater and uses it at the facility. This reduces Dow's freshwater draw in the city by over 1.3 billion gallons per year, which is saving that fresh water for the city. But it's not all about cities and agriculture or cities and industry, right? So the next one is about sustainable agricultural systems. And they were going to play a huge role in the transition to a brighter water future. I know this is a specifically important issue in the Carolinas as well. But one of the great bright spots here is in Madison, Wisconsin. The Madison Metropolitan Sewerage District realized that they couldn't succeed in meeting their phosphorus requirements and getting enough phosphorus out of the Yahara watershed by themselves as a water utility. It would take this huge partnership effort. So they put together a tremendous integrated watershed scale planning approach that's set up called the Yahara Watershed Improvement Network, Yahara WINS. It's a network of farmers and cities and nonprofits all over the whole watershed working together to keep hundreds of thousands of pounds of phosphorus out of the water every year in partnership together. I mean, just the idea of bringing together agriculture and cities who have been at loggerheads for decades over what's going on in our water systems. Like this is a tremendous step forward. And I think it's another great one water example. But nothing we do is truly sustainable unless we're striving for social and economic inclusion. That's the kind of like fifth area. Remember my lesson from just a second ago that the most durable solutions are equitable ones, regardless of income, race, age, location. All people need access to safe, affordable water services, and investments in water can address inequity and can help get us get us to that equitable future. And like we have to be super upfront about this in the water sector, right? Like we have a long way to go on this. But there are some really great examples of programs and communities that are already leading the charge. Like the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, for example, was the first in the nation to adopt a community benefits strategy policy, community benefits strategy policy that leverages water infrastructure investments, like these huge investments that the city were making to generate multiple benefits back to their community. So when like big firms are bidding on new work and new developments for the utility, they have to demonstrate quantifiable, measurable commitments to community benefits. So that includes things like direct financial contributions to community organizations, volunteer hours in the community, or workforce development training, like that kind of thing, to help ensure that the utility itself was an anchor partner in seeing equitable opportunities for the community that it was based in. Finally, I know this is going to be near and dear to a lot of y'all's hearts, but we have to advance our One Water vision through relationships with waterways and watersheds. One strategy to really keep watersheds clean and healthy, I'm sure some of you all have seen some of this before. This is a big deal in Chesapeake Bay watershed where I'm from, but using trees as a buffer between rivers and pollution, like conserving and expanding forest cover, it's a crucial and a cost-effective way to reduce that pollution and protect drinking water in a source like where I'm from that serves over 17 million people. So there's a lot of different ways that you can think about how our relationships to watersheds lead into that One Water future. So those are sort of the 6 arenas. I know I kind of went through them, but hopefully you can see like, oh, I fit in one of those, or I fit in a couple of those, and my work really resonates with some of those ideas. Like I said, these One Water strategies sort of address challenges by incorporating as many of those perspectives from the 6 arenas as possible, with representation from those perspectives at the solution development table. That is so critical. I have to underscore that again, with representation from those perspectives at the solution development table. And as I kind of make my way towards the end of my time here, I want to pull together one of the threads from those 6 arenas that is a super crucial piece. And just like I asked you to write down and put in the chat, the most durable solutions are equitable solutions, I also want you to write this down: water is about people. So when the speakers that are coming up behind me and I sort of first met, we started talking about our work, which has a lot of really incredible applications, but in talking realized that people was the sort of common underpinning to not just the work that we were all doing, but why we did the work. It was so eye-opening. It really helped me see the whole in the pieces, and I understood the fundamental connections that brought us all here. And that's One Water. It's looking across the disparate parts of water and seeing the whole in the pieces. It's that holistic systems thinking mindset. It's watershed scale thinking. It's innovative, it's inclusive, it's integrated. It's building the public and political will for positive change by connecting our water work to people. And if I had to pick a single word for this, I know I just threw a bunch at you, but it's collaborative. And that's why at the beginning, I asked you to think about why you do what you do and what brought you to water. I want you to really hold on to that connection, because that's not your answer to, that's not only your answer to what is One Water, but also why One Water. So I hope that that is a helpful frame for some of today's conversations. And I hope that this helps you think about your own work and where it fits into One Water, and starts really get you thinking about how can I be collaborative in my work, and where does it connect to people, and how can I create equitable, durable solutions with my work for people in water. So with that, I'm gonna pass it on to the next person. And I really look forward to all of y'all's questions, and my contact info I'm sure will be passed around. So thanks, Susan. And I think I'm tossing it to Frank.
Yep. Thank you so much, Scott. We very much appreciate it. We're going to include you in the Q&A at the end of the panel session. So there will be time enough for us to engage with you and the panel. So Frank Lopez, our Extension Director, will be facilitating the next panel. Frank, I'll let you get to it.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Scott. Thank you for getting us off to a good start here. And I think I really enjoyed hearing collaborative being an important word, because we've got 2 days of panels, and that's a common thread that's going to run through them both. And so, you know, I think it's a good way to kick us off. Our group this afternoon, and I'll introduce them quickly, just to give you an idea of the lineup, but then later on I'll give you a little bit more detailed introduction before they speak. Our first speaker is Dr. Jamie Dewitt, then Dr. Austin Gray, then Dr. Rachel Noble, and Dr. Michael Paul. And besides all getting doctorates, they don't have a lot in common. They have a lot of different disciplines. We have chemists on the panel here, people that have interest in molecular biology, all the way up through macroinvertebrates and traditional biology. So it'll be a broad look at science and the role of science in water resource management. Tomorrow the theme is more strictly collaborative, and in fact, it's community engagement. But I think you're going to also hear some threads of that with our speakers this afternoon. So without further ado, I'll get started. Our first speaker is Dr. Jamie Dewitt, and Dr. Dewitt is an associate professor at East Carolina University. Her lab's research program focuses on functional effects of environmental chemicals on the immune system and its interactions with the nervous system during development and adulthood. She has PhDs in environmental science and neuroscience from Indiana University in Bloomington. She completed postdoctoral training in ecotoxicology at Indiana Bloomington and immunotoxicology at the US EPA in partnership with UNC Chapel Hill. She ends the week here talking to us, but early in the week, she was testifying for Congress about PFAS. So, a full schedule of presentations, and hopefully we're not as frightening a group as they are. So with that, Dr. DeWitt, I'll let you take it away. Thank you, Jamie.
Well, thank you for that very nice introduction. And hopefully you all are a less nerve-wracking crowd than a subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. And normally I would be at a conference like this, like Scott, talking in person about some of the science that I do in my laboratory. And I would be talking about assays that we've done to study per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. But I'm going to take a slightly different twist today and really talk a little bit about how my research experiences with PFAS have really changed the depth of the work that I do in my laboratory. And I hope the depth and breadth of training that I'm giving my students and other people who work with me in the lab. So this is a collage of people who have worked on PFAS or are working on PFAS in my lab. And as Scott said, water is people and science is people too. So one of the joys here. Normally, when I give talks, I include a lot of scientific information. So a slide like this makes me feel very wonderful because it's filled with all sorts of data that we've produced in my lab. We might take some raw compounds and look at what they do to the immune system. We would use things like an enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay to look at antibody responses, to make some really cool graphs about how a vaccine response might be perturbed by exposure to PFAS. We might do some metabolomics to ask questions about what metabolites or what metabolic processes are impacted by exposure. And we would make more graphs because that's what scientists do. We take our data and we turn it into graphs, and then we take those graphs and present them at scientific meetings or public meetings or submit them to journals where they get published. And we share our data with other scientists in very scientific manners and very scientific ways. We might develop some new hypotheses from our data that will help us to get grant funding so we can ask more questions about these chemicals that we're studying over here, these per and polyfluoroalkyl substances that are in water. I started studying PFAS in 2005, which seems like just yesterday, but is quite a ways away. I'll let you do the math on that. I was a postdoc at the US EPA, and I was funded through the Office of Water. And they said, we're concerned about some of the potential immune effects of this thing called perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA. And we'd like you to do some assays on PFOA to determine if we need to worry about it as a potential immunotoxicant. And oh yeah, it's in water. It's been found in drinking water. And there are some concerns that it could be, people could be getting exposed to it, and it could have an impact on public health. And so as a postdoc, learning methods in immunotoxicity, studying PFAS was an opportunity for me to learn a little bit more about how exogenous agents, such as PFAS, affect the immune system. And so this first graph down here in the corner came from my postdoc. It was one of my first PFAS papers, and it was published in 2008. And it was the springboard into all sorts of other science that let me make great graphs and great papers. And in 2016, a paper was published in Environmental Science and Technology Letters, and it concerned PFAS around the United States. And it was a survey of different utilities and public water information from an unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. And the authors of this study mapped out areas where there were detections of PFAS. And I looked at the map and went, wow, that's a lot of PFAS. And I looked at North Carolina where I live and went, wow, there's a lot of PFAS in North Carolina. I'm kind of glad I'm studying them in the lab, and kind of went about doing my work in the lab and publishing papers and communicating about PFAS. And then a little bit more information came out about this. A different paper came out in 2016 that concerned PFAS specifically in North Carolina, and it concerned PFAS detected in the Cape Fear River watershed, which is really not that far away from me. I live in Greenville, North Carolina. Wilmington's only a couple of hours away by car. And I went, oh gosh, I didn't even know we had a manufacturing facility for PFAS here in North Carolina. I wonder if there are PFAS in the water that I drink here in Pitt County. And I wonder if there are any reports for PFAS in UCMR3 for Greenville utilities. And I did go and look that up, but PFAS were still, they weren't in my watershed. They were somewhere else, and I was studying them. So I was doing the right things. I was developing more scientific information about PFAS and what they do to health, but it was still, not my problem and not my family's problem. And then a big article came out about PFAS and about a specific PFAS known as Gen X that most of us here in North Carolina are now very familiar with. This came out in a newspaper. And I remember thinking, wow, I can't believe there's a newspaper article in a regular old newspaper about one of the chemicals that I study. And I had done a study in the lab on Gen X, and it was published in a journal called Toxicological Sciences. And shortly after this newspaper article came out, everything about PFAS changed here in the state and in my laboratory and in my mind, and not to be too corny here, but in my heart as well. And what changed is this map here. This is a map that was put together by the Environmental Working Group that demonstrated the presence of PFAS across many different states. Here in my now adopted state of North Carolina, it's nearly covered, not because we have more PFAS contamination, but because we have a testing network that's been able to uncover points of contamination. And if you look for PFAS, you're probably going to find them. And so I started looking at this map and went, oh gosh, I'm from Michigan. I have family in Michigan. Oh my gosh, my niece and nephew live just in a different county from Parchment, where there's been some issues with PFAS contamination in water. And I've got family in Illinois and Oklahoma and Minnesota had a big lawsuit because they have all sorts of PFAS in their environment. And oh my gosh, I have friends in Colorado and California. Everybody I know has come into contact with PFAS. How do we avoid these persistent chemicals? How do I make my work matter for the people who I care about and the people who I have come to care about because of their experiences with PFAS? I started to feel pretty anxious, to be honest, about the responsibility that I now have in my lab. And that anxiety was made even worse when I received letters like this. This is from a firefighter, a civilian firefighter at a military base. This individual was told that aqueous film forming foam, which is a complex mixture of PFAS used to quench fires, was not a problem. It's no worse than bubble bath. And I actually shared this in my testimony yesterday. He said, we're not getting tested for levels of PFAS in our body, but I'm reading all this stuff about the health effects. I'm worried. I know people who are getting sick. I have cancer. What am I going to do? What can you do to help me? And then I started getting emails from people in North Carolina. I have autoimmune disease. I've survived cancer. I have thyroid problems. What can you do to help me? What can you tell me about these chemicals? How can I avoid them? How can I understand the risks of my exposure on my health? Dr. Dewitt, can you please help me? I was overwhelmed. I was absolutely overwhelmed by the number of people who reached out to me, who professed to trust me and my knowledge about these chemicals that I was studying in the lab. I don't work with people. I'm not a medical doctor. And so PFAS have really forced me to become more empathetic about the people who are impacted by the chemicals that I study in my laboratory. And I'm going to end here with a picture of my family. These are all the people in my life who are really important to me. And everybody has family that is important to them. Everybody has friends, everybody has connections. And working with PFAS has really forced me to take my science to a different level, to empower decision makers to make decisions that are going to be important for all people who are consuming contaminated water. So taking that one water concept and applying it to the toxicants that I study. And with that, I'm sorry, I got a little bit emotional. I can't help it. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Jamie. What we'll do is we'll hold questions until the panel meets together at the end of the session, and then we'll have an opportunity to ask questions. That if you'd like to put one in the chat now, please be my guest. You know, that may be a way to help not forget something as we get to the session. But we'd like to keep the speakers going straight through, and then we'll have time to have some questions at that point. So thank you, Jamie, for getting us started on this section of the panel. Our next speaker is Austin Gray. Dr. Austin Gray attended the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where he received a PhD in environmental health science. While doing his doctoral studies, Dr. Gray was a Sea Grant and WRRI research fellow. So we're very proud of his work and seeing where he's going in his career. His research focused on the effects of emerging contaminants on aquatic ecosystems and ecosystem processes. Contaminants of interest for Dr. Gray include pharmaceuticals, plastics, microplastics, and personal care products. Dr. Gray has recently been hired as an assistant professor at Virginia Tech University, and he'll start in that position next month. So with that, welcome to us, our program, Dr. Gray.
Okay, can everyone see my screen, hopefully?
Yes.
Perfect. And good afternoon. Thank you for joining this panel. I'm very honored to be a part of not just a panel, but to be able to continue giving back to WRRI. As Frank mentioned, my dissertation was heavily funded by WRRI as well as North Carolina Sea Grant. So this is just an opportunity to pay it forward and to highlight exactly the amazing work that they sponsored for a student to do. What I'll be talking about today is antibiotics within North Carolina streams. And it won't be so much of a technical talk, more so just my own journey itself as to why I focused on pharmaceuticals for my dissertation research. And that goes back into my time previous to my dissertation in Charleston, South Carolina, where I spent time at the Citadel investigating microplastics. And investigating microplastics was a segue for me to understand not so much just community engagement, but also how different environmental contaminants can be pretty much caused by humans themselves. So when I transitioned to my dissertation, I wanted to focus within pharmaceuticals because I thought this was a pressing environmental issue that not a lot of people were really understanding. So when I talk about pharmaceuticals, these have been classified as contaminants of emerging concern by the EPA, meaning that in global water supplies everywhere in the world, these compounds have been found at trace levels. And there are several types of pharmaceuticals that are available in the market, spanning from antibiotics to opioids to antivirals. But for my dissertation, I focused on antibiotics specifically because antibiotics themselves are not just used within human medicine, but also in veterinary application. In the United States alone, 4 out of 5 Americans are prescribed antibiotics every year. And 80% of all the antibiotics that are administered in the US are given to farm animals. So because of the dual use of antibiotics, they have a prolonged use or exposure within the environment that has resulted in antibiotic resistance or bacteria that are no longer susceptible to antibiotics. So they've become resistant to them. So if you're infected with these bacteria, ultimately, if you're treated with antibiotics, they're ineffective. And in 2013, this resulted in the death of almost over 3 million people were infected, resulting in the death of over 35,000 individuals. So the reason why I focused on antibiotics also shows that it's not just an environmental issue, but it has a human health component as well that is a pressing environmental issue. And water seems to be the one central factor that spreads this resistance as well as this contaminant throughout various ecosystems. So when I talk about antibiotic pollution within water, I want to talk about specifically streams. And there's various sources or pathways in which antibiotics can enter these areas. In rural areas highlighted in blue, you have animal waste and manure lagoon runoff. One idea, one part of ingesting antibiotics most people don't understand is that when humans and animals ingest antibiotics, only 10 to 20% of these compounds are broken down. So within our waste, a large amount of these compounds remain in active form. So in areas, rural specifically, where there's animals that are giving antibiotics within their feed, their waste retains a large amount of these compounds that can run off into nearby streams after a rain event or overflow into nearby streams after flooding. Within urban communities, it's a little bit different, and it's more so the result of human impact, where in urban infrastructures, degraded sewage systems where individuals who discard their antibiotics in the trash or down a sink can ultimately leach into nearby waterways. You also have hospital effluent, where individuals that are prescribed antibiotics are then released into the effluent into streams. You also have those that discard them into the trash, where they can leach into soil and groundwater, ultimately infiltrating into nearby surface water. And you also have wastewater effluent, which is a major contributor because these facilities don't have the instrumentation to properly remove antibiotics. So again, as I mentioned, they enter the environment in active form. When antibiotics enter nearby streams, they can also infiltrate into groundwater within certain communities. And as you know, within rural areas, there's a lot of reliance on well water for everyday use. So this spawned more of my research interest into understanding, okay, antibiotics are present, but what's the impact? So within North Carolina, I sampled antibiotics within streams and groundwater in 3 counties. In Guilford County, where 26% of the population are relying on drinking wells. In Randolph County, where 58% of the population are relying on drinking wells. And in Alamance County, where 60% of the population are relying on drinking wells. These counties themselves also are heavily dense within animal populations that are utilized for farm or agriculture purposes. And rather than focusing within Eastern North Carolina, where there's a heavy density of CAFOs, I wanted to focus within an underrepresented area, specifically the Piedmont, that has now received a great amount of attention pertaining to these type of contaminants within nearby streams, as well as drinking water. And then going back into my central question was, are antibiotics entering people's streams and drinking water? Just a little bit of highlight as to what I found within my investigation within the Piedmont of North Carolina. We look at rural waters, and this includes surface water and groundwater. I detected 15 different antibiotics of human and veterinary application. The max concentrations I found within surface waters were as high as 1,200 nanograms per liter, and this was the antibiotic sulfamethoxazole, which is a prevalent human and veterinary antibiotic. However, in people's well water, and again, this is water sampled on properties, the concentrations were even higher, as high as 1,800 nanograms per liter, and this was from danofloxacin, a primary veterinary antibiotic within rural communities. When comparing the rural waters towards urban communities, I found that in urban streams within the Piedmont, specifically Greensboro, there were less antibiotics detected, where there was 10, and the concentrations in surface water were not as high, where they only maxed out at 20 nanograms per liter. So the takeaway from this was that within underrepresented rural communities, they seem to be more at risk of antibiotic pollution. And this was a very important part of my research because, again, in a lot of the literature, a lot of focus seems to be within more urbanized or central municipal areas of antibiotic pollution. However, what I'm showing here is that within central North Carolina or the Piedmont of North Carolina, these rural communities are more prevalent and more susceptible to antibiotic pollution, especially within people's drinking water, which are utilized every day. Again, showing more warning as to why we should continue or focus attention to these communities as populations expand, as urbanization increases. This creates the need that we need to investigate this more. And a big part of my research that I talk about or I utilize within my dissertation was the use of social media. In a lot of cases, I think there's a lot of stigmas around social media and sharing your work, but one thing that I've been able to do is utilize social media to not just share my work, but also share my outreach. And in the days of COVID, where face-to-face interactions are very limited, using social media is a very prevalent or inclusive way to reach a broader community. And just from 2 example posts that I made here, you can see that from these 2 posts I made about my research and I talked about my outreach, I was able to reach more than 3,000 and almost 5,000 individuals just from posting. And what that means is that individuals that may be within the science community and those outside of the science community were all able to understand or at least engage with me to have dialogue, ask questions, facilitate different parts of antibiotic work that they may want to know about. So again, this is a very inclusive way to reach a community that may not have the same access that we have as scientists or as students or as professionals, where before you had to publish work to get notoriety or get recognition. Now you can engage the public in a very inclusive way that allows you to not just have a certain presence within your research, but also reach a broader audience. And here is just a quick overview of a couple of screenshots from previous presentations that I've had in the past, whether it be a national or a regional conference. And the highlight of this slide itself is to show that even if you have your own network and you share on social media, you can also have individuals that live tweet your presentations, and that then reaches a whole nother network of individuals that ultimately reach out to their network and they follow you. And again, this is how you can build your brand and promote your work at the same time. So while social media can be somewhat seen as a negative in some sorts, in regards to our work as water scientists, this is a very proactive tool that can be utilized to reach a very big audience outside of your own community. And again, creating that dialogue so that the general public understands that as scientists, we serve them, and that by engaging them in ways that they can get access, we're doing our job better. And that's something that I believe in truly is, as scientists, our job is to communicate with the public, to translate our work effectively. And if we aren't doing that, then we're failing the people that we serve. For those that are interested in following me, my Twitter is here below, Austin_Doug13, and my email is there as well. I'll be staying around for questions, but if you do want to engage with me on social media and see how I utilize Twitter specifically to share my research, engage, and also talk about community outreach, please feel free to do so. And I look forward to talking to each and every one of you at the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Austin. And so I already see a couple of questions for you that we'll get to in a few minutes. So from the Piedmont streams, we're going to head out down to the coast and have Rachel Noble join us. Dr. Rachel Noble's research program bridges environmental microbiology and marine microbial ecology. A main thread of her work is the application of molecular techniques for applied and basic science. She has developed a range of rapid water quality test methods and studies the dynamics of microbial contaminants contributed through stormwater runoff to high priority recreational and shellfish harvesting waters. Dr. Noble received her PhD in marine biology from the University of Southern California, and she is the director of the UNC Chapel Hill Institute of the Environment field site in Morehead City. So welcome to our panel, Dr. Noble.
Great, thank you. Really great to see the crowd that's online and get a chance to talk to you all a little bit, admittedly, about also one water type topics, but talking now about the coast where we have quite some mixing of different types of water. I first wanted to say to everyone that I'm going to have to improve my field photography for insertion into my talk. As noted, Austin, you had a fantastic talk and actually many fantastic photos that also convey, great moments of your work. So I'll have to up my game in that department at a later time. You can also see I'm interested to hear more from Austin about connecting with younger generations, but my Twitter handle is represented in the title slide here at the @WaterUNC. So just talking a little bit about this crowd is not new to existing major concerns along the coast here. We seem to be a hotbed for the intersection at the land-water interface of change, sea level rise, tidal inundation, urbanization. I'll talk a little bit more. Concerns about stormwater delivery and impacts. Someone wrote in the chat earlier about having compounds escape the NPDES permitting structure, but think about all of those compounds that exist in stormwater and other non-point source types of materials to the coast that are completely unregulated and unenforced. We do a lot of work at the coast here on native marine pathogens like Vibrio species. I'm not going to talk about them today, but we've really increased our gain in the area of wastewater discharge and impacts. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. What I'd really like to convey to you today is the need for connections between our research and engineering groups and strategies, particularly environmental consultants and engineering firms along the coast, because some of the issues that I'm going to talk about are very complex and they require a rewire of our thinking about issues related to coastal infrastructure and coastal development. So I'm going to be really brief about this. Now everyone knows what quantitative PCR is and digital PCR is because of COVID. So I do say that there's actually a silver lining to the pandemic, because no longer in a presentation is there a need to kind of describe what this is. The advent of molecular markers, as you know, for COVID-19 have allowed us to protect public health, but they also allow us to understand something about the risk associated with contact and ingestion of contaminated waters. So by that, I'm talking about swimming, and I'm talking about you can also consume pathogens that can make you sick and antimicrobials and other contaminants. You can also consume, particularly through shellfish that are filter feeders. And we have prominent concerns in the viral kind of area, not just SARS-CoV-2, but in a world that also contains norovirus, hepatitis A, adenovirus, and so forth. And these are global problems. Stormwater and wastewater translate to millions of cases per year by both contact and by consumption. So just providing you a little bit of fodder for what I really mean. Whenever we're talking about contaminants in coastal systems, we're really talking about protozoan, bacterial, and viral pathogens. And I'm not going to go into detail on the methods associated with these, but if you're interested in understanding the technical side of the implementation of water assessments for pathogens, please feel free to contact me. I've added in this lovely figure from the CDC of SARS-CoV-2. And I also wanted to highlight, as related to Austin's talk, that the interest in antibiotic resistant bacteria and even residues that stem from wastewater and other operations, and other emerging concerns, including African swine fever. I mean, none of us want to hear that there are other viruses out there poised to wreak havoc on human populations, but unfortunately there are. So it makes sense for us to build surveillance strategies that can begin to capture these from a more top-down perspective. I don't think any of what I'm presenting on this slide is a surprise to anyone who's traveled in North Carolina. We've seen incredible building and development along our coastline. Anyone who cares to take a look at the real estate prices along the coast of Eastern North Carolina, it's never going to approach Southern California because we have mosquitoes, but it's gotten to the point where there's a lot of people that would like to live along the Eastern North Carolina coast. In particular, I draw your attention down to the bottom right of this graphic that basically shows you a little bit about the area, and I apologize for the circle. It's actually in the wrong spot. But you can actually see the elevation of the land. The whole point of that part of the graphic is to show you it's very flat. We can go about 30 miles inland here in North Carolina and gain about elevation in some cases, in some areas of about a foot or two feet. So when we talk about sea level rise and tidal inundation, it translates into big issues. So let's talk a little bit about stormwater outfalls. We've done a lot of work in North Carolina paired with the research of Dr. Mike Peeler, also at UNC Chapel Hill. And we've understood the importance of stormwater contaminants along the entire coast, stemming from work that's been done all the way from Wrightsville Beach through central eastern North Carolina up until Dare County. And we know enough to know that our stormwater pipes are conveying high levels of contaminants during storm and also tails of storms to our coastal systems. What we didn't really understand fully before was the amount of actual inundation that we were observing in specific areas where we see loading of human and viral and bacterial pathogens that are achieving 10 to the 12th viruses or bacterial cells in a 24-hour period. You read that correctly. Our standards, as you know, probably for fecal indicator bacteria on the order of 104 mpn per 100 milliliters. Now, this is a load, not a concentration, but you can see the ability of the estuarine environment to dilute this significant load of contaminants becomes quite problematic with the rainfall that we've achieved in the last few years. Now layer in the known impacts of tide and sea level and the engineering solutions along the coast, particularly in the coastal plain of North Carolina, and you have a situation where our typical hydrograph-based estimates of loading are no longer functional. This is actually a photograph, excuse me for the animation that stepped up quickly on the coast, but you can see in the background photo, this is a photograph of a normal day, not a hurricane situation and not a extremely high tide at one of our outfalls here in the town of Beaufort. This level of submersion is experienced often, daily, weekly, monthly. This is something that we see, and saltwater is penetrating into these systems and compromising these systems extensively. So what we see is the need for us to understand, using advanced molecular approaches, is to try to understand the impacts of rainfall, intensity, duration, and accumulation, to try to understand the content stemming from aging infrastructure, and to use a combination of fecal markers using molecular approaches to try to understand the patterns of what is being delivered into coastal environments. And let me just show you a quick example of what we've found. So here's a tidal diagram of the height in feet at a location right next here to the town of Beaufort. You can see the departure for Hurricane Florence of the tide. I mean, excuse me for not having these in metric units, but this is the height in feet. The red box, excuse me, is supposed to be around the 7 feet, but you can see that the 7-foot mark is a 3-foot departure from on the height of the water from normal. This is going to cause the amount of land in the red to be completely underwater. If we translate that to a hydrograph kind of an examination, what we see at one of our locations is the tide being reflected as the blue line that's simply going up and down. And you see the discharge or the velocity of the water stemming from an outfall pipe in the town of Beaufort. Lo and behold, it's only during the low tide periods that stormwater is able to come out of the stormwater pipe. Once it transitions back into high tide, you can actually see the stormwater is being held back in the pipe, and only when the low tide returns do you actually see another pulse of the stormwater coming out. This is completely different from how we're currently assessing our loading using a hydrograph-based approach where we don't attend to inundation. So very quickly here, I'd just like to draw your attention to, I know it's late in the day, but I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that we also see the resulting contamination from that stormwater pipe where the velocity of the water was being held back. Surprise, the actual contaminants themselves are being held back as well. And so our loading estimates and the ability to actually control those loads using stormwater mitigation measures and stormwater control measures are going to be impacted if your system is suffering tidal inundation, because they're not going to be behaving the way that we have typically thought with some applications that some would call like the first flush kind of a concept. We're working on revisions to this publication and should have it resubmitted in no time, and I can provide this document to anyone who would be interested. So let me just talk really quickly about pathogen surveillance. We know that we can use pathogen surveillance. We've been doing lots of work on wastewater and COVID-19. We know that we can do pathogen surveillance for infrastructure repairs and risk assessment, for marine disease surveillance. And that some of these molecular methods have advantages and sensitivity that go beyond our culture methods that have been used for decades here in North Carolina. I wanted to kind of finish with the idea that we are interested in using an approach of molecular surveillance that allows us to connect our findings across septic inundated systems, representing rural areas, moving into peri-urban systems and metropolitan systems. And we've gone too long across the country, and I would argue too long even here in the state of North Carolina, where we've focused our attention on these metropolitan systems only. So in agreement with some of the points that have been already raised by Dr. Dewitt and Dr. Gray, there's a need for us to comprehensively evaluate these systems across the board, and to not only focus on our major population centers. And with that, I'll stop for today and later take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We'll keep going here. Our next presenter, before we have a chance to let the audience engage, is Dr. Michael Paul. And you know, if you're like me, one of your first experiences in water resources management is getting in streams and trying to do macroinvertebrate assays. You know, it's a far cry from where I used to be doing those things to the type of science that Dr. Paul is doing. He is a senior scientist for Tetra Tech and is headquartered here in the Triangle. Dr. Paul is an aquatic ecologist with more than 25 years experience in the research and management of aquatic ecosystems. He received his PhD in ecology from the University of Georgia at Athens and is an expert in urban stream ecology, biological assessment, and water quality criteria development. He lives in Carrboro with his wife, daughter, and an entourage of pets. So with that, Dr. Michael Paul.
Thank you, Frank. Can you hear me and see me all right? Can you see the screen?
Fine. Yes.
Okay. You see my presentation?
I don't see your presentation. I see you.
Okay. Hold on a second. I probably have to do this.
There it is.
There it is. Thank you.
Is that the whole screen?
Yeah, it looks good.
Great. All right. Thanks. Thanks, Frank, and thanks to Anna and Susan and John and Katie and Team WRRI for doing a great job pulling the conference on this year. It would have been tragic to go another year without at least seeing everyone virtually. So thanks a lot, you guys, for doing this. Much appreciated. I did want to talk just briefly about a few challenges in water resource management to try and put it into the context of all the great stuff Scott presented on One Water. I want to try and tie some of these things together, but in the spirit of sort of the challenges I'm dealing with and I see coming, especially for students in the audience wondering, you know, where might you want to invest the next decade or two of your careers, where are there real needs for innovation and from my perspective in stream ecology and inland waters. So one of the areas that is of interest to me and my team's been working on is in diagnosis. And so a lot of times, you know, we get into streams and we discover that that there's some sort of impact, and the fish are gone, the bugs are gone, some of the algae are disturbed. We're seeing a different community there, and sort of the first detection is that we have a problem, and then the question that comes is, well, what's causing the problem? And this can be really hard to do because as you've seen from the previous speakers, there's a lot of stressors in the environment, a lot we don't normally monitor for. And the ones we do monitor, we don't monitor a frequency that we need to pick them up. So the bugs are integrating all those chemicals, but our water quality sampling and measuring in the laboratory may not be picking them up. So we're really interested in trying to understand if the bugs can be telling us a story about what stressors are out there. So one of the things we've been involved with is developing these tolerance value type indices for different insects, using their preferential sensitivity to stressors like metals and pH, sediment, organic enrichment, you name it, oxygen, and seeing if there are very taxon specific or small assemblage specific signatures for specific stressor categories. And using that information in a fingerprinting type way to help us identify what might be causing the problem in a stream that is impacted biologically. We've really improved some of our ability to diagnose these stressors. This is some data from a data set from the state of West Virginia, where we're using a variety of different inferential techniques, using multivariate statistics and univariate statistics and combining organisms together. And you can see that for some of these techniques, 60 to 90% of the time, we're able to correctly identify what the dominant stressor is in these systems using the invertebrate community that's there. So the big challenge here is trying to figure out what that next generation of tools is. Of course, we'd love to be doing more of the DNA and metabolomics type work that Dr. Dewitt talked about, and that's certainly the future. But we're hoping that there's something we can do. Communities are out there collecting these invertebrate samples regularly as part of just telling if there is a problem or not. And our argument is there is a wealth of information in there, hidden in each invertebrate body, that tells us a story about what might be going on in terms of stressors in that environment that need to be remediated. So that's one of our big challenges and one of the things we're working on to try and improve. The second area is in prioritization, and that is trying to figure out where among the variety of major impacts we have in our environment, in our stream communities, where should we be investing resources? Where can we make the biggest investment difference for the dollars that we spend? Because there are a lot of problems out there, and we know that the size of our pie is only so big. And as Scott was mentioning, we live in an area of trade-offs where we have to make decisions. We've made decisions that there are a lot of benefits of having urban areas in terms of efficiency of providing services to human beings, but those come with costs associated with environmental impacts. We're trying to develop ways to minimize and maximize those, but there may be limits to what we can achieve in terms of getting streams to where we want them to be when we build a city on top of them. So we've been working on a project funded by the Stormwater, the Urban Consortium Stormwater Group of North Carolina through the North Carolina WRRI to try and identify what are achievable outcomes biologically in terms of urban streams in North Carolina. We've developed this biological potential tool that tries to establish realistic benchmarks for where we might be able to achieve improvement in urban streams, and where streams are as good as they can be, or even in some urban settings, while they might not be hitting a one-size-fits-all statewide standard, they're better than we'd expect for that type of urban stream. Maybe we should be protecting that type of urban stream versus trying to spend money to make it even better, because it's really already doing about as good as you can expect. And so, I, along with some colleagues at NC State, this is a recent paper by Jonathan Miller, who was a PhD student there, is trying to extend this technique to see if we can't use this information to prioritize where we should be protecting urban streams, where we can be making some difference to restore some urban streams, and where we should just be monitoring to make sure those systems don't get any better, but there's not really a lot of additional improvement we can make. And so, a big challenge is how can we improve on these models, and how can we implement them into policies that align water resource management with this reality. The third area challenge, and one of the areas we're working in, is in restoration. And that is this question of, can we get back to Neverland? How much biology can we restore? So many of you are familiar with this, the pyramid, the functional pyramid approach. We do a really good job at restoring hydrology and hydraulics, somewhat geomorphology. Then it starts getting harder with physical chemical restoration, and then biological restoration is a real constraint in urban streams. People have tried things like stocking, where you take macroinvertebrates like you would fish to restock a stream, take macroinvertebrates from healthy areas and try and stock them in urban streams. We're doing a bit of this in North Carolina, I know, and there's groups in Europe trying the same thing with kind of limited or partial success. Part of that is ecologists have a lot of work to do. Instead of just complaining about the failure of stream ecology, taking some of the concepts we've learned in ecology and applying them to try and improve urban stream ecology. Brad Taylor at NC State and a student have done some really interesting work looking at things as basic as how does a mayfly approach a stream? Like, what types of rocks do they need to oviposit on? And how stable do those rocks need to be to ensure that those egg masses that are laid will stay there forever? And if we're not providing that level of life history detail, then the aquatic insects that need that space won't be successful at reintroducing there or sustaining a population there. There's groups in Europe in the middle here. This is how a mayfly views a landscape spectrally. And so on the top, you see this is what light looks like to a mayfly is looking for an overposition site. On the bottom is asphalt. And you can see the spectral signature looks very similar for a mayfly. That asphalt looks very similar spectrally than a stream does. And so we have these types of constraints to convincing these insects not to be ovipositing on the landscapes that they shouldn't be doing it and doing it to the ones they want. And then lastly, working with landscapes to understand how insects move across the landscape along corridors and across the watersheds, and realizing that there may be matrix constraints to how these organisms can move along. And so that's part of the constraint of why we can't restore biology the way we can, is because the matrix upon which these insects normally move and disperse is imperiled as well. And then lastly, something that really struck me in terms of Scott's talk is that the last conference I attended, which was in Austin, Texas last February, before we all went into shutdown, was a symposium on urban stream ecology in Austin, Texas, where a bunch of ecologists and engineers and planners got together and community members got together and trying to solve this problem of urban stream restoration, which is a very wicked problem. You know, there's lots of dimensionalities to it. And what dawned on all of us was that, you know, stream restoration is watershed restoration because the watershed rules the stream, and watershed restoration is community restoration. So we can't restore streams without restoring the human communities around them. And trying to do that is folly and likely to be unsuccessful in the long term, because the community won't be invested in the stream and the stream will no longer meet the needs of that community. So that brings it around to the stuff that Scott was talking about really resonates, where I think urban stream ecology and science is heading, is trying to span the same divide that Austin mentioned and that Jamie mentioned and Rachel mentioned between the science and the human communities, and realizing that advances we're going to make in addressing these challenges have to be in concert with the communities that benefit from the services those systems provide. So thanks again, Frank, for inviting me.
Thank you, Michael. So we'll start to interact with the audience a little bit here. You know, I have a couple of questions that are in my chat, and you're welcome to continue to add those there to the chat if you'd like. But if you want, you can start just to raise your hand on your screen, and we'll start to queue those up, and I'll tee those questions up kind of in the order that I see them. So the first question I have that was in the chat is for Austin, and I think there's a second question for Austin as well, because I think he touched on something that is important to us all related to communication. But the first question is, you know, thinking about rural waters, and are the antibiotics found in those rural waters predominantly vet-administered antibiotics, or was there a mix? Were these antibiotics deemed medically important to humans? And you know, if there's any publications that you can throw us to, we'd appreciate that as well.
Yes, I will share the link to one of the papers that I published pertaining to this work. And just to answer the question itself, of the 15 antibiotics that I found within rural water, streams and drinking water, or groundwater, majority of them had dual application for human and veterinary, but the antibiotics that had the highest concentrations within sediment, surface water, and groundwater was danofloxacin, which is a primary veterinary antibiotic given to cattle, chicken, and horses. So that antibiotic having the highest concentration shows that within these communities, that does play a role within contributing to antibiotic pollution.
Thank you. And then the next question is for you as well, and that'll give us time to maybe tee up some of the questions from the audience at large. You know, you seem to be the generation that can really help us improve our ability to communicate with younger people. Could you talk a little bit more about connecting with that crowd?
Yes, I do acknowledge that I have a little easier time just because I am young in the face. So even though I'm 30, I look a lot younger than I am. But I feel it goes back to more so just my upbringing and my training going back to Charleston, South Carolina, where the work that we were doing was always featured as a backyard study. So even though we had these research projects that had these broader impacts and had far-reaching legs, I always went into a project thinking that it's a backyard study. It's something that I'm doing in my own community, something that benefits not just the people, but also those close to me that I care about, specifically my family. So for me, when I engage with individuals, whether it be face-to-face or social media, I try to keep in mind that not everyone has the same experiences that I have. Not everybody has the same background that I have. And there's people that may know more about a certain topic that I may not know. So I kind of check my ego at the door and make sure that as I approach or engage the public, it's never from a position of being a superior or above them. It's more so just, this is the information that I'm passionate about, and this is how I wish to convey it or share it with you. And like I said, our job is to just share the information and translate it. But as far as the ease with it, I think it is very, it takes practice. It's not something you can just do outright and get it down properly. It takes time, and I like social media, so engaging in social media is a little bit easier for me to kind of figure that out. But you also see when you follow, say, Twitter, you have a lot of examples of what not to do in regards to how to engage the public. So you have kind of like a live workshop every day where you can see this person did it this way and they did a really great job. I'm going to mimic that. There's a lot of science communicators that use Twitter or ResearchGate or Facebook or Instagram to share their work. You can follow those individuals and see what you think works best, because if it works for you, it typically is going to work for other people. But again, making sure that you utilize those resources and that you don't just flood the information out there to the public, but you give them doses, or you make it palatable so that they keep coming back for more, or that they are satisfied. But I think following individuals that are specific to science communication, engaging with those folks and seeing exactly how you think you would want to be communicated to is valuable tools.
Thank you, Austin. So the next question I'm going to ask to Jamie and possibly Scott as well. It's related to PFAS and whether PFAS should be one of the constituents in PFAS permitting, and whether or not there's a policy piece related to reducing that contaminant.
Well, I can say that in the past, there have been NPDES, or National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, permits issued for PFAS. I know that at one point, West Virginia had issued one for Gen X in effluent from a facility in West Virginia that may have been the focus of a recent movie starring Mark Ruffalo. I don't know about in other states, but they have been part of NPDES permit emissions.
And the only thing I have to add is at a federal scale, I mean, the last administration really, I think, decided to slow walk one way or another what it was working on PFAS. And I think you're going to see some new different things coming out of this administration, for what it's worth.
And just let me add, we don't have any water regulations for PFAS on the federal level as of yet. We have state level maximum contaminant levels in 6 different states, I think now, but no federal level. We have a health advisory for 2 of the nearly 10,000 substances that we call PFAS.
Thank you for that. One more question for Austin. Is there an acceptable level of antibiotics in surface water? And that's kind of thinking about water quality standards.
Yes.
Is there a range?
So typically antibiotics themselves are not regulated by any state or federal level. There's certain maximum thresholds or different thresholds that affect different aquatic organisms as far as ecotoxicity. But again, these things aren't regulated from wastewater effluent or from runoff. So the fact of these contaminants being in the environment with unregulated concentrations is a prevalent issue that can pose more issues. And if anyone wanted to talk more, some of my dissertation showed that even at low levels, these antibiotics and mixtures can have an effect on ecosystem processes, specifically nitrification.
Thank you. I don't see any questions with anyone holding up their hand. So I would like to ask a question to Michael, because you think about urban streams, and oftentimes these are the places that are the very hardest to restore. High impervious surface areas in watersheds, incised and oftentimes high velocity flows in those systems. So I guess my question is these are places that a lot of our communities deal with in doing restoration in those areas. What can you say about what is acceptable in terms from a biological standpoint in those urban systems that you're finding from your research?
Yeah, that's a good question, Frank. And I mean, it expands the argument to really, and my vision of this is expanding rapidly to adhere more to what Scott's talking about, and that is, I think if we view the benefits that stream restoration provides in more than just what we can achieve in terms of aquatic biology, but what we can achieve in terms of green spaces for people to recreate, in terms of economic opportunities associated with streams in terms of recreation or education, pollination, all the things we can do with the riparian buffers around streams, and de-emphasize exactly how, what bug can we get back and where can we get back. There are improvements we can make in biology in some urban streams, but there's so many other benefits that would accrue that make it that we need to combine this biological potential construct with, like, the incremental improvements we can make with all the other benefits that can come from some urban restoration projects in certain areas, that it helps soften the blow for maybe we can't get the stream back to what a forested stream is, but there's so much more that this stream will provide in addition to just getting some of the biology back. So it is a bit of humble pie swallowing for a stream ecologist to say we have to maybe say that we can't have rainbow trout and certain mayflies in every single stream in North Carolina. But I think in the end, it's much better for our communities for us to achieve those kind of improvements, and it gets people loving streams, which means it will get more political clout to protect the streams that are really good, that we're not doing an adequate job of protecting right now, anyways. So that's not exactly the right answer, but it's part of the answer.
You're right. I think there's an element of pragmatism that has to be taken into consideration in terms of those restorations. Susan White, I believe, has her hand up. Susan?
Thanks, Frank. I'm sort of wondering for all, one of the overarching messages is partnerships and collaborations and how we can't go it alone. Are there ways that, selfishly what can WRI do? What can our academic institutions do? What can our engineering firms do? How is it that we can create these collaborations that are successful and not just one-offs from a funding perspective or from a partnership perspective?
I guess I can lead off just from what we've seen before. So I think that, organizations like WRRI or, academia in general can play a really strong role as conveners for a lot of these conversations, sort of as neutral spaces. Well, maybe not neutral, but neutral in the sense that you don't want to see an outcome, but neutral in the sense that there's a place where folks can come together to have the kinds of tough conversations that we need to have around some of these super large challenges. And I think you're seeing some of those kind of examples even within North Carolina now, like the Jordan Lake One Water Collaborative has been another really, really strong example of bringing lots of disparate folks together to consistently and from the beginning include lots of different kinds of folks at the table to develop a solution, and they're working towards that kind of thing. So I think that playing that sort of central role is one of those places that you all can really achieve, and making sure that a lot of the different kinds of folks have a seat at the table, right? Like that's the other thing that I can see you playing a really strong role in. Is making sure that those equitable kind of ideas are are centered as part of that kind of conversation as well.
I would add to that, one of the things that came up at this Susie meeting last year in Texas is being engaging participants in the communities, not just parachuting into these scientific projects as if they're opportunities for only us to gain benefit from as scientists, but seeing that doesn't look exploitative, but that we are really invested as members of these communities in the improvement of these watersheds and the welfare of these communities. When we go in and just exploit these opportunities for project uses and don't see that we are members of those communities as well, or need to be engaged in those communities well beforehand and through the duration and long after, then we seek losing the trust of those folks and the long-term cooperation, and that's hard. That's hard to do. It's hard to do.
Yeah, that's a great point, Michael. And like, I'd like to add to that, that attitude is also important among scientists. We also need to continue to develop new collaborations to bring in junior scientists to help them to grow and become passionate about the work in the ways that we are, and to continue to work with scientists who maybe have gone down a path that's a little bit different. So we can only grow our understanding of the ecosystem and of how contaminants affect the ecosystem if we have these great transdisciplinary collaborations across different age groups and wisdom groups of scientists.
This was a very enjoyable panel. I really appreciated your perspectives, and you know, I got to be kind of a great role as moderator. Is we got together. We had a great discussion when we were talking about organizing our thoughts. I wish we could have recorded that and played that for you as well, because that was a really nice discussion. So thank you all for participating. And I'm going to wrap this up and hand it to Christy Perrin of WRRI to talk about what we're going to be able to see when we're going to break here.